Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Words with Dani. I am not Dani. I am Emily Moyer from Off Planet Radio, and Dani Katz is here with me. What's going on, Dani? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Everything. It's a new moon in Sag. Happy new moon in Sag.
Happy new moon in Sag. We were, usually we end up like pre-showing and talking to each other for like 30 minutes before we start, but then we realized we missed the best part and we can't usually recapture it during the show. So we caught ourselves starting to do that today and decided we would just start the show. And so you'll probably get some of our usual warm up to each other before we really get into it, but sometimes the best stuff is there anyway. So, all right. So you sent me a text. We didn't even talk about what we're going to talk about. So that's good. So you sent me a text last week because you saw the cover of the, was it The Nation or Atlantic?
The Atlantic.
The Atlantic. Cover of the Atlantic magazine that had the red and the blue handprint, right? Was
yeah,
it handprint?
It was one handprint, half red, half blue.
And it said Civil War, right? Or what did it say?
How to stop a civil war. And
yeah.
I lost it.
And she had a meltdown in the market. I'm sorry, you were at somebody's house. You had a meltdown when you saw it.
I was at somebody's house, and I was like, it was such a 180 in terms of vibe. I saw it, and I completely flipped out. I was like, this is a thing? This is going out? People are seeing this? Like, how?
So I saw it at Whole Foods last week. I was the one who saw it in the market. And I like opened it for a second, but then it was my turn and I put it back and whatnot. And then you told me a little bit about it. By the time I went back to get it, it wasn't on the stands anymore. So I'm just using my psychic abilities and my making shit upness to try and intuit what was in there. But the interesting thing about this is when Alex Jones talked about this, like, Bill Cooper was the first person to talk about this really in a conspiratorial sense, right? Back in the 90s, and then Alex Jones kind of stole his line and, started doing all the hysteria with it. But when Alex Jones started talking about there's going to be a civil war, everyone's like, that's crazy. That's a conspiracy theory, blah, 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 right?
Right.
And now, like, reality has become inverse to the point that now the left is the conspiracy, like the left peddles more in conspiracy theories than the quote unquote right or the usual conspiracy people do, right? And so now it's perfectly acceptable, for them to have a magazine that talks about the possibility of civil war. It was crazy 10 years ago when Alex Jones did it, but now it's okay because everything is reversed.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Alex Jones, put his faults and flaws aside, which we all have, is always like kind of speaking to the future, right? He, like you and I in our own ways, is like been tracking the larger globalist agenda and talking about where it's going to go and the pieces that are being put into place. And I think the left is now taking all the bait, right? Like the left doesn't realize how they're being used in this agenda.
Right.
And how they're the ones who are driving themselves into a really shitty, and all of us into a terrible situation.
Yeah, what's funny about it though is the left is being used in the same way that they would have said that the right or the conspiratorial crowd was being used back several years ago, right? Like,
How so?
Okay, so it used to be that like people would say that someone like Alex Jones or someone like Ron Paul or whatever, right, were speaking to people's fears in order to drum up support for an agenda that actually it was antithetical to their best interests, right? And so now the same thing on the left. The left is being through all this hysteria around Trump and racism and Cold War nonsense and all this kind of crap, the left is being steered to actually make decisions that go against their interests. You have the left now rooting for war.
Oh, 100%. Because the left doesn't understand what's going on.
Right. So you had the right, you had people on the right who a lot of them are people who are like from the middle of America and who are rural and maybe don't have a ton of money. When they were listening to the things Alex Jones said or following Ron Paul, they were being accused of voting against their own interests because they weren't for social programs. And now, now you have the left who are supposedly about peace or whatever, like voting for candidates who are not only not peace, but are like completely bought and paid for by the military industrial complex, right? So it's really interesting to see how this thing is shift. And I'd call the middle point of this would be like, I don't know, maybe it was like 6 or 7 years ago that Jesse Ventura wrote a book where he compared the Democrats and the Republicans to the Crips and the Bloods.
Yeah.
Right. And so you and I had a quick conversation about this the other day.
Would you elaborate on that comparison a little bit?
Yeah. So he basically, like, we're trained to think of politicians as like upstanding citizens and gentlemen or ladies. They wear suits and they speak eloquently and they go around and they talk with people and whatever. But essentially that they're no different than your neighborhood Crips and Bloods, that these are, like mafia cartel kinds of organizations, the Democrats and the Republicans, right? And that it's really like a turf war, but just so that, that was kind of his description of it. And I would go farther in saying, and I'm sure Jesse Ventura, I didn't read the book, I heard him talk about it a lot. I'm sure Jesse Ventura knows this and would speak to it to a certain level. I do think Jesse Ventura is a steam valve. Like, I don't think he's a completely clean player. I think he's a decent guy, but I think he's there to ultimately keep people spun back to the party by believing that there'll be a Green Party candidate or that there'll be some Democrat that'll come along that'll be okay. Just like somebody like a Ron Paul or an Alex Jones talks about all this, liberation from government, but ultimately steers people back to the Republican Party or to the Libertarian Party. So what they did, like the way that the gang, there's been gangs for as long as people have been alive, but when we're talking about like the societal gang crisis that happened, that started really in Los Angeles in the 1980s with the crack epidemic, right? And so you had in the, poor neighborhoods of Los Angeles, the Crips and the Bloods, and they were fighting each other for turf and territory and drug control over drugs and things like that. But all those drugs were being brought into Los Angeles and made into crack by the CIA, as was revealed by Gary Webb and Freeway Ricky Ross through the Dark Alliance papers. And what was happening there was that they were, it was the whole thing with the Iran-Contra and Nicaragua, right? They were shipping arms to Iran, right? From Iran to Nicaragua to fight the Sandinistas. They were taking cocaine from Nicaragua here to Los Angeles, selling the drugs, taking that money to Iran. They had this whole triangle going on, right? And they were literally bringing cocaine into Los Angeles, and then after that, other big cities. And they basically, invented crack. There had been freebase cocaine before, which people had to do on their own, but this was a way of pre-making freebase cocaine so it could be sold in small quantities so people in poor neighborhoods could afford it, because you could buy it in little $5, $10, $15 pieces, right? As opposed to having to buy a large amount of cocaine to make it yourself. Yep. And so what they did is they put the cocaine, they through Ricky Ross, who has come out and talked about it since then. He didn't understand what he was getting into, but they made sure that there was a plentiful and a never-ending supply of crack cocaine in these neighborhoods, and that there was, factions of gangs. And what they would do is these surplus guns that they had from the Iran-Contra Nicaragua situation, they would leave them in unlocked, like U-Haul trucks in these poor, bad neighborhoods, like full of guns. Right. So then you had these gangs that were completely armed and totally just, at war in these certain areas of Los Angeles. It didn't really travel outside of that. Like, it never came up to the areas that you and I were living in. We didn't know about it really at the time it was happening. You and I learned about it as we became aware later, right? Maybe we had heard of Crips and Bloods, but it was like they were as far off as Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy to us, right? So this happened in big cities all over the country. It started in Los Angeles. And basically, they used the weapons of drugs and guns to tear communities, to get communities fighting with each other, to hollow them out by taking all the young men who could provide for their families, and instead either having them become gang members and drug dealers, and a lot of the women or mothers became drug addicts, and all the men were out doing drugs and sleeping with other women, and they created all this crisis in the family, where that then led to some of this increased welfare state that came along with Reagan and whatever, right?
Right.
Like that whole kind of thing. Okay, so that was
also got them to kill one another, right?
Yes.
This undesirable faction of society, and then also got to take the men out of the homes and put them in prison. So it was
right. So the men,
so many different levels.
So many levels.
Powers.
You had the communities fighting with each other, right? So these were poor communities who were killing each other. Meanwhile, the wealthy people who were supplying the drugs were making money off of these people who were killing each other, right? The men were going to prison, and so doing slave labor, which we have seen in documents that have been released about why they like private prisons and all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. There's been that whole conversation, and about how they used hip hop to increase the number of people who live in the, who are in private prisons and things like that, so they can use that as slave labor. We've heard about all that kind of stuff. So they created numerous crises. They created a generation of children with no fathers, minority children with no fathers, and all that kind of stuff that leads us right to where we are now, right? Where you have a situation where they're using racism as this political tactic, identity politics as this political tactic, saying that the reason that minorities have been suppressed is because of institutional racism, or the fact that all white people are inherently racist, whether they know it or not.
Well, that's kind of the switch, because it doesn't seem like anyone's actually addressing the institutional racism, although I know Trump just undid something that has switched up the prison situation, but they're trying to make it more of an interpersonal thing.
Right.
Which is where it's gotten so gross.
Well, but here's my point. So we now have the suppression of minority communities being blamed on racism, as opposed to being blamed on the fact that drugs were brought into those communities and the government encouraged women to get rid of their men who were using drugs and to instead be married to the state, who would provide them the money that the man couldn't provide them. And so you now have a generation of children who've grown up without fathers in the home that have perpetuated these cycles of fatherlessness, violence, and inability to thrive, even though there are opportunities, right?
1,000,000%. But they're distracting us from putting our attention on the government and the politicians who've created these policies and created this scenario, so that now we're fighting with one another.
Right. So fast forward to what's going on with the Republican. So Jesse Ventura makes these comparisons because he knows about that kind of stuff. They're doing the same thing, but instead of using drugs and guns, because that was an effective tool for physical violence in small areas and communities and inner cities and things like that. But they practiced it there. It was like a laboratory for what they were going to do later. Now we have an entire country at war here, supposedly, right? This civil war. Supposedly. But the weapons of war are no longer guns and drugs. The weapons are words and
identity
and the internet and Twitter, and so language has taken on the same power that a gun and drugs had before, right?
Absolutely.
And so now you have gangs out in the streets, right? You have the Trump people. It's just red and black this time. You have the Trump people in the MAGA hats, right? And you have Antifa dressed in black, right? And Antifa's going around mostly hitting people with bike locks, but claiming that the right, they're basically creating mayhem and violence in the streets, right?
It's a tiny percentage. I've never seen Antifa. Have you?
No, I've never seen it, but that's what gets coverage, right?
And that's where do I see MAGA hat wearing?
I've never seen it.
Maniac, white supremacist. I've never seen any of these things.
I've never seen, but this is what they show us on the news. Every certain number of weeks, there'll be some standoff in a city at a protest, usually Portland or something like that, or somewhere in the Pacific, right?
I've only heard of Antifa in Portland.
It seems to be the Pacific Northwest.
Northwest.
From Oakland to Seattle, it seems like in that corridor there is really weird. Just like they did the drug one here in Los Angeles, right?
That's where they're sending all the opiates as well. That's where all the...
That's where a lot of the sex trafficking is going on right now. A lot of the drugs, Portland and Seattle have had homeless people, in San Francisco, homeless drug problems and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the opiate crisis is super palpable in the Pacific Northwest. You could really, really feel it.
Yeah, so there's that. There's the Antifa. There's some of the sex trafficking stuff. But that's where it seems like every 6 to 10 weeks, there's some kind of protest of the Proud Boys and the, or whatever, and the Antifa, and a journalist. So we're going to get to this other point that I have later about what I think the real purpose of Antifa is. But since we're going to stick with the Civil War right now, so now it's the red and the black now, right? The black is defending the blue, because the Democrats don't really call out Antifa, because it's kind of most neighborhoods, they didn't necessarily like the mafia, but if they took out a person that was causing problems in the neighborhood, they were kind of okay with it, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I also just want to, like, I don't really know much about Antifa. I'm not seeing that in my world, but I am seeing the people in my world who are identified with the left being the psychos. So I hear what you're saying about the black, like, taking on the
it's a symbol.
Blue.
Yeah.
But, like, I'm seeing the leftists act like bigoted hate mongers.
Right.
In such a huge way.
Yes. So we have, but this is the sides now, right? Where the sides were the Crips and the Bloods in the 80s. The sides are now the right and the left, right? And the emblems or the symbols of it, like the symbols back then were the red bandana and the blue bandana. We now have the red hats and the black scarves.
I guess. I mean, I still see, I don't see it as moving that far away from, like, the donkey and the elephant. Like, it's all still so, like, engineered and stupid. But, like, I'm willing to suspend my disbelief on the Antifa thing to roll with you here. I'm just not, like, that's not my experience. Like, the left being their own psycho.
Absolutely. But the way that it's being symbolized in people's minds, right? Because we understand, like, we see the right and the left issue going on in Congress, obviously, with the impeachment nonsense and all that kind of crap, right? But when people when people think of a civil war, they think of it, oh, one of these protests is going to get out of control. And that's going to spark the, whatever, right? There's like something's going to happen, like if Trump wins again or if Trump doesn't win.
I feel like it's going to happen in January. Like when we look at, and I don't want to take us too far off track, but you look at the astrology for January, that's when it's going to be the shit show.
This January?
This January's astrology, the 10th, 11th, and 12th is going to be off the rails. And my sense is like, the impeachment is not going to go the way the Dems are hoping it's going to go. Right. And they're going to have another hysterical, emotional freak out tantrum and escalate it to some crazy place. They're buying into this notion that people who voted differently are their enemies when the only enemy are the fucktards who are failing us and trying to vax us and 5Ging us and communizing us and all that shit that we're not talking about because everyone's too occupied with bullshit.
Okay, so yes, all of that stuff. And what's really interesting, I was having a conversation with a friend the other day who's extremely left. She's an older woman. She's extremely left. In some ways, maybe she's like, you're Judith, right? Okay. I don't know Judith, but like I watched her comment enough on Facebook. An older woman who I am very fond of, but yeah, we're politically completely misaligned. I mean, I'm out of the picture. I don't write letters to Santa Claus, but I like to observe and just comment on what I see. It's a lot easier to be logical when you don't have a dog in the fight.
Totally.
But okay, so she is not a dum-dum, and she is also not a naive person. And I've known her for enough years and whatever, right? She honestly thinks that Trump is going down. She thinks that Trump is going down, right? And
yeah, it's the same thing as everyone who thought Hillary was going to win. They're playing that same chord in the public's emotional body.
Well, that's how they keep them tied in.
Yeah, totally.
They keep roping them in by doing it. And what most people don't know, because the media is left, is that back when Obama was president, all the same stuff was being said about Obama. It was just being covered in the alternative media because the mainstream media won't cover what the right's opinion is. Every week there was a story about how the military was going to go in and overturn Obama. They were going to arrest him. There was going to be this, that, the other thing, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, so do you not think it's going to happen?
That Trump is going to what?
That there will be civil war?
So I think there will be. I think that we've been having civil war for a while, but it's not going to look like any kind of civil war. It's already started. Like, just like, what the thing about human beings for the most part, especially the more modern we get and the farther away we get from our like primitive selves and our like primordial kind of our like instinctual needs, right? Is that by the time we're talking about something, it's already happened. And we don't realize that the reason we're talking about it is because we're commenting on what's already happened, as opposed, we think we're predicting the future, but we're actually just sitting around in the wasteland of what happened, commenting on the wreckage, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And at the same time, I also think that people like you and me are living in the future. So I think it's all of it. Does that make sense? I know your earphones just went cuckoo pants. I think you might have lost my brilliant commentary. Wait, babe, now we can't hear you. The sound, we just lost all of our sound.
Hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right, hold on. And can you hear me now?
Totally.
Sorry about that, guys. I got really excited and knocked my own earphones out. My apologies. Please repeat your brilliant comment so I can hear it.
What I was saying was, yes, I see that is resonant, that once we're talking about it, it has already happened. And I also have the experience of people like you and me already living in the future. The things that you and I are experiencing now, there's kind of a lag time in other people living up to them. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Because our timelines are no longer synchronized for whatever reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we're able to sync up with people from other timelines temporarily because we are attached to them through our emotions. So it's like I can get together with my dad for lunch, even though we're existing in totally different realities.
Right.
And for that hour or 2 hours where it's lunch, there's like that friction of the incompatible timelines. Yeah. But because regardless of all this other stuff, I still have that human attachment to my father called love, right? Like we still do that. Right? So there's that. But I think that like what's happened, it's not going to be like, there's probably going to be a token amount of bloodbath in the streets, right? But just like what you said, like you don't ever see Antifa, you don't ever see MAGA. Right. So I think
I don't think that matters. Like, it's just like the fact that TSA exists for made up reasons. It's like, it doesn't matter that we see things, they'll make up reasons to put us into a police state. And given that we know that is their aim and their agenda, I wouldn't put it past them to put us under martial law for our own protection.
So that was my thing that I was going to get into with you, because about the police state, right? So
I didn't mean to steal your punchline.
No, it's perfect. You didn't steal my punchline. It's perfect. So I think I sent you a text the other day saying I wanted to talk to you about Antifa, Andrew Yang, and facial recognition software and how all of these things are tied together, right? Yes. So, and I was watching that show. I was rewatching the show with somebody who hasn't seen it because I think there's some important things in there called Person of Interest that was on a couple of years ago. Okay. I don't know if you ever watched this. It's a J.J. Abrams show, and it's about the fact that like we're watched constantly. But this premise of the story is that this person, Harold Finch, who developed he's kind of like a Bill Binney guy, right? You know who Bill Binney is? The guy who developed the thin thread software, and then they used it in a different way than he had intended. Yep. It's sort of the premise of this. With this, it's like he developed this software that was meant to look for terrorists, but what he realized is that it actually identified every crime, every kind of crime that went on, and it was classified. That's what's happening. Right. It classified some as the ones that are mass in scale and related to terrorism as relevant, and all other ones, even if it included murder of innocent people, as irrelevant. And later, after he had sold this to the government, he decided he could not live with that. But he had built a backdoor into this. So he hired Jim Caviezel, who was in the special forces and had, lost his way because he couldn't live with the fact of what our government was doing around the world and whatnot. He hires him to basically go around. He's got this backdoor where the machine, he calls it the machine, spits him social security numbers of people who are going to be killed. Right, that had nothing to do with terrorism. And Jim Caviezel is supposed to intervene and stop it, because a lot of these would be sometimes the person whose number comes up would be the victim, and sometimes they'd be the instigator. But either way, if he gets there in time, he can stop a murder from happening, right? And so, but as part of this, you can see how the way that the surveillance works, all the facial recognition from every corner of every street and every place you go, right? Part of the series is really watching it through closed circuit television cameras, right? Okay. Like that's a big part of it. So this is that, there's certain aspect of surveillance that is being used for good. It gets into some other things as the series goes on. But we were watching this, and my friend says to me, like, something like, why is this allowed? Or like, she had a question that I don't even remember right now, but I was like, she's like, well, I said, well, this is the whole point. This is what everything is really about. All this other fighting is a distraction. They want to keep us distracted, some of us distracted so we don't pay attention to the police state that's already here, and others of us because our political emotions get so high, we'll actually end up begging for a police state with the idea that we'll stop the other side, right? We'll stop the other side, but we've just brought in the tyranny that's actually going to bring, forget sides, everyone down. And my point is, yes, right?
That's the whole thing. That's why I have no tolerance for the sham show. I can't even like fake my way through a conversation about it anymore, because I'm like, can we just talk about the real thing that's happening? Because we no longer have time to dilly-dally over pronouns and who's blue or red. Like,
right.
It's barreling down, like the 2020 Real ID, Agenda 21.
Right, you got it. So
vaccinations, it's all here now. And that's why I flipped out about the Civil War, because I'm like, they're really gonna take it this far? Like, we're really there? It's like a game of chicken. Like, I can't believe that people have gone this off the rails as far as buying into the distraction.
Right.
And we're still not going to talk about what's really happening.
All right. So here, I'm going to explain to you what's happening and how people who think that okay, so this is what's happening. The purpose of Antifa, right, because they wear masks, right, is to be there causing mayhem, right? And in the beginning, it's just the right that's anti-Antifa, right? The right or the center or the people who are sane. Right?
Sane.
Yeah. And then later, the cuckoos on the left will become anti-Antifa because like at a certain point, that level of violence will be not good for their cause.
Do you think so? Wait, and I just want to clarify.
At a certain point.
When I said sane people, I was not referencing the right. I'm talking about people like you and me.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying there will come a point where Antifa's antics go so off the rails that even the left will distance themselves.
At least publicly. They might secretly like still want it to go on because they do think that there's some people who are so far gone on the left that they do think that someone who disagrees with them does deserve to be hit over the head with the bike lock. But they'll understand that they're supposed to be uppity left liberal, the professional left class, the professors and things like that, and they're not supposed to endorse violence. So publicly, they'll say that there needs to be a stop to Antifa. And the thing that will be offered, it's already happening in small ways, and I'll include a video about this in the description. I watched a video of Andy Ngo, NGO, a gay Asian reporter who was beat by Antifa on June 29th, right? Yep. Speaking just recently at the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, and he is a center-left, Andy Ngo is a center-left person. He's now speaking at a conservative think tank, and
the formula, right?
Right, but at the end of his talk, towards the very end, his recommendation for what we should do about this is that we should ban masks in public, okay? And so, here's where I'm going with this. Antifa is there to get both sides to come together to demand no masks in public.
For facial recognition.
For facial recognition software. Because in the future, they're going to use the facial recognition software to identify people who haven't been vaccinated, who aren't obeying Agenda 2030 laws, who don't vote, right? All that kind of stuff, who don't have a real ID.
Also, I want to say, as you're saying in the future, and having just said a few minutes ago, the future is now.
Is now, right. It's already happening. They're already doing it, but they haven't announced it yet, right? They haven't announced it yet. So we're in this like interesting spot here, okay? And so...
I love your use of the word interesting.
Right. So basically, there's two ways this is going to go. Is some of us who don't want to play ball, we're still going to want to go out of the house, but we're not going to want to be harassed and harangued. At first, it'll just be being harassed by other citizens, right? And then it'll be that they're coming after you. So we may want to wear a helmet in public or a mask, not because we want to commit violence, but because we want to stay sovereign from the video cameras, which it isn't really freedom to do that. And so most of us are not going to do that, but they're predicting that there's people who are going to be who are going to live in the fear base, in the fear thing, and they're going to do that, right? And so there's going to be that, and then it's also going to become a way. It would be a way for other citizens to identify those who, like, then the citizens are going to be like, oh, we don't want people who aren't vaxxed coming out in public. And so some of them might want to wear. They might say they might want to wear something. So it's going to be both sides that ultimately are going to be prevented from protecting either their herd immunity or their identity, depending on which side they are and who's after them.
Well, have you seen these ads for the jewelry that sort of combats the facial recognition software? I've seen a couple articles on it.
I've seen the clothing. I've seen some of like the sunglasses and the clothing. I haven't seen jewelry.
Yeah, there's this jewelry with like pieces that hide the cheeks and pieces that like cover the forehead that are specifically designed to like screw up the facial recognition software, which sounds like it will come under the same sort of no mask rule that Andy.
Right.
So why is it that everyone who used to be center left sane all of a sudden becomes a right-wing nut job?
Because here's the thing. I think Andy No is sincere. I think he is scared, right? But this goes into, I'm pulling a lot of threads here, but there's one of the guys I interview on my show, Masaki, and then he's talked a lot about the way that the Asian Americans are used in the mind control program. And a lot of times he likes to refer to this guy, Daryl Hamamoto, who wrote a book called Servitors of Empire. And it was about how Asians are basically are doing the work that supports the police state. A lot of them are engineers and work for Google and this and that. And they do all these kinds of things, ultimately, work against their interests as quote unquote minorities, but support the technical class that are the technocracy.
Well, it's like all the Black and Latino cops in LA. I'm like, why are you enforcing rules that are steeped against you? I don't get it.
Right. So you have Andy No, right, who he was beaten and brain damaged, and they have not arrested the person who did it, even though you can actually see him for a second. His mask fell off or something like that, and you can see they haven't arrested him. Right? So he's sitting here like asking for no masks in public. And it's kind of like, it's kind of like the woman who runs Amber Alert was the one who was child trafficking the kids to Haiti. Right? Like it's kind of like you have it's
like the Clinton Foundation.
Right. It's like the wolf in sheep's clothing, or the wolf guarding the hen house or whatever, right?
Right.
So you have him there, and he's a sympathetic character because this is a guy, who I think he's sincere. I don't think he's insane. For what he's been through, that sounds like a good idea because he's not conspiratorial enough to have thought this through to its logical end, right? That's the thing, is that they have all of these different groups of people that know a lot about information from a certain perspective. But because they haven't, have you ever been to one of those art exhibits where, like, if you look at a piece of art from one side of the room, it looks like a duck, and the other side looks like a bunny, or those paintings they used to have?
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
So only if you are looking from up top or from straight on can you see that there's both possibilities, right? But we have the right and the left, and they're looking at the same monstrous piece of art and seeing different things because they don't know there's another side of the room to look from.
Well, it's so distorted because they're looking within the lens of the construct, which necessarily distorts it, so no one can really see clearly. One piece that I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't point out, and I don't want to take us too off topic, but I heard a bunch of interviews with Andy No right after he was attacked, and I also heard a lot of commentary, and something that I do feel like is important for us to acknowledge is there's a certain level of provocation that is going along with people who are being attacked or who, do you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
And that goes without, he was warned by a number of people, like, are you sure you want to go in there?
He was warned by Brett Weinstein. Yeah. He was,
Exactly. So, and none of that is to say he deserves it or whatnot, but because of some other things that I'm witnessing happening in our culture, I would just love for us to be more honest about.
Right. They're being used as tools.
Well, and also, just for full transparency, when I watched, and I think I told you, I think I sent it to you when I watched the Steve Bannon interview about what's going on with China. And
the Huawei and all that stuff,
Yeah, and I thought it was fantastic. And so for a moment, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And I had this sympathy for what Trump's doing as far as getting the U.S. out of China and out of that economic slavery. And what I noticed was that when I was in the headspace of, wow, he might actually need an extra 4 years to carry this out, that it came along with this sort of provoking energy. There was and it was interesting to observe in myself, it's interesting to tell people that I am entertaining the notion of maybe voting for Trump. There was something in it.
You liked it. You liked getting people's goat. Yeah.
I did. And I've since pulled myself out of that, and I don't, I don't have enough information. But there's something about, in terms of like the larger mind control conversation, there's something about that provoking energy that I am seeing pervading the landscape on both the left and the right.
Yep. Well,
it's really, like,
both.
I think it's fueling those volatile flames between all of us.
Both on the mass scale, which is what you're talking about, but also on the individual scale, when you're an individual who's been subjected to more direct mind control, where that is a phase of your deprogramming, where like I was doing that for a while, about like 6 or 7 years ago, where like I was intentionally like sending my dad like, you know, provoking articles to look at, and like I don't do that anymore, nor do I enjoy that. Right? Like I really don't. He thinks I still do, but I really don't, because I know when I was doing it and it's not now. You know what I mean? So it's a phase of coming out of the mind control on a certain level but that awareness is great. Like a lot of people either don't have that awareness, or even worse, they have the awareness, but they don't have the honesty to admit that. So very good for you on those levels. That makes you a lot less controllable going forward, that you can not be too embarrassed to say that you do that.
Well, I think it's important for us to get real about what's going on, and like, oh, I did, because I mean, you know me, I'm apolitical. I'm like you. Like I don't really have a dog in this fight, but for a moment I dipped my toe in, and it was interesting to notice how quickly that provocateur energy came in, and where there was like an identity, the allure of an identity around pissing off the left.
Yeah.
And so I just feel like it's important to name it. Like, I'm not embarrassed. I'm human. I'm part of the collective.
Yeah.
Like, I figured it out and let it go. But I see a lot of dishonesty among people who are being attacked.
Yep. I agree.
Being marginalized. And it's like, can we just get honest about what's going on? And can we just unify and deal with the real monsters in the room?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. Yes. And so I think because of that, those people that's how you become a useful idiot. Someone like Andy became a useful idiot.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is where I just thought of this while we were having the conversation. Enter our other Asian, Andrew Yang, right? This is where Yang comes in. And I know, like, your theory is that he's the Trojan horse, and he's gonna, and it's possible. So he's taking on MSNBC. He's held steady in the polls. He's raised a lot of money. He's buying at commercials on TV now, and he is starting to challenge some of the mischaracterization of his campaign and kind of stuff in a way that is bringing him forward in some ways, right? But here's the deal: he has there has been no discussion about whether he wins or not. This idea of universal basic income is going to become more and more prominent, right? And there's going to be no discussion about whether or not when this comes in, it's going to require vaccination, if it's going to require people vote.
Of course it will.
Right? And so he also is, bringing in this kind of thing that it's like, you can identify the people who are, and then there's going to be this like secondary class of citizens who don't take their UBI, right? Because they don't want vaccinations and they don't want to vote. So they have all this negative stuff against them, and they should be outcasts, and they have to live in, in the margins of society.
Well, of course, because that pathway also includes the point system that comes along with communism. Like, it comes along
yes,
with all
the social credit system. Yes.
100%.
And this also goes into, and I'm going to get into a conversation with Robert probably next week about what my thoughts on people who like the idea of Medicare for all and what I think that really is. So I don't want to go too far into that. But
what that is
you dum-dums,
right?
You dum-dums,
what is going on? You
dum-dums who want Medicare for all with a single payer system, no ability to have private insurance or whatever. Just so you know, that's also going to require forced vaccination, right?
Dude, let me tell you, under Obama and his dumbass Obamacare, I went to a clinic in Silver Lake to get an STD test because I'm a responsible adult. And to get the test, I had to sign something that said they were allowed to vaccinate me with whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted to. And of course I scribbled in my signature, this does not count. I don't know if that counts. But that was already, like, anyone who thinks they're getting a free ride is insane. Plus the fact that, like, Big Pharma is running our food supply, our
right.
our everything. So anyone who's signing on to that system and wants more of that has their head up their ass. Like,
yeah.
you can't talk about healthcare without talking about clean water, food that's not fucked with. I mean, all those things. I don't want to dive into your show with Robert, but like, it's such a larger conversation that really has to do with
it is.
food
but
supply.
These things are all connected, and the thing that they're connected by is facial recognition software, because they want to be able to identify not only who the political person non grata is, but who the anti-vaxxer is, who the person who doesn't vote is, who the person who isn't, doing all of their good citizenly duties, the person who used too much water in their shower last week, the person who ate beef and that has cow farts, or all this kind of shit, right? Like,
of course, the wrong thinkers.
I read this book this week. I read this book this week, right? Like, it was a health book, and it was about like acidity and alkalinity. And this guy is the guy who wrote this book. It's an old book, but I had to read it for something, right? And it's so outdated. But the guy is literally like demonizing protein, and the way he the whole book was him telling you in 1,051 different ways why protein was bad for you. But it was basically, it felt like an SJW fight between like the right and the left, or the feminists and the anti-feminists, the pro-protein and the anti-protein
versus protein.
Yeah. It was just kind of, it was basically like he was like alkalinity good, acid bad, but the different digestive organs need different environments. If you don't have both, you're fucked. And so this was kind of like, I was laughing through the whole book. I kept commenting on how this was like the SJWs between vegetables and meat. You know what I mean? It was all a fact. It's everything. Yeah. So, so that's kind of my thoughts on that. Do you have any divergent opinion on that? Or are you just totally with me? Do you think what I'm thinking is insane? What do you?
No, of course.
I mean, it actually is insane. It's insane that people would do that, but that's where we are.
But that's where we are. I think what's insane is that you and I and this small group of people seem to be the only ones who get it and who are talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that, like, whenever I have the UBI conversation with people about, like, well, why are we signing on to automation? And they're like, well, we already have. There's this like powerlessness thing, which is so frustrating. No one seems to be linking socialism with the communist agenda, which are always.
Did you ever watch the interview with Yuri Bezmenov?
No.
Okay, so we were just talking about this at dinner the other night. I was out to dinner with my friend Leo, who's Russian and whatever, and he always likes to talk about this. But Robert's talked about it a lot. I've talked about it over the years. He is a person who defected from the KGB in Russia and came over to the United States a long time ago. And you can watch this video. It's from like the 80s of him talking about, it is true. There is a Soviet infiltration of the United States, but it was an ideological one, and it happened in the education system in the 90s. It infected the university system and the academics and all that kind of stuff, and it came in under Reagan. You can go listen to Charlotte Iserby or what's the other guy's name? I can't think of him. They talk about him on Tragedy. He wrote the book Tragedy and Hope or whatever, right? But it talked about the infiltration of our academic system. And this guy, Yuri Bezmenov, is talking about how, the different steps of the infiltration of communist thinking, right? And a lot of it has to do with demoralization and ideological infiltration, and that it's to take over everyone. But the people who, in the end, are going to really be thrown to the wolves are actually the left, right? The left are begging for some of these things to come in, right? But they're being useful idiots for this infiltration, this kind of infiltration. So I actually think it's part of the plan to have them focused on this dumb thing with Russia that isn't true. And meanwhile, missing the fact that their entire lives are based on an ideology that came from the same country that they're now against for a reason that is stupid and makes no sense. And they're missing the whole point. And so you guys can go, I'll link the Yuri Bezmenov video underneath here as well, and people can watch. But if you look at what he's talking about now, we are in the final stages, or maybe even done with, the complete infiltration. And ultimately, the left is going to be, like, they'll take them out. The left thinks that, like...
Well, that's what's hilarious about the Civil War scenario.
Right.
The left is anti-gun.
Right.
How is that even going to go?
Right.
Which is the whole point of all the, like, false flag shootings.
Right.
And all this, like, outrage about we have to get rid of the Second Amendment so that we can be a disarmed public, so that when they come for us to put us in the camps, there's no fighting back.
Right.
So I guess my question to you, because I agree with you on all fronts, and just to circle back before I get to the question, is the reason that I so lost my shit about the How to Stop a Civil War cover is that they've escalated it to that point. Like, once you've said how to stop XYZ, it's like all the people on the left who are now identified as anti-racist. Like, if the task is to stop a civil war, then all that requires validating the legitimacy of a civil war.
Right.
It requires validating the legitimacy of this level of hysteria and outrage. And it gives momentum to this thing that has been implanted into the minds of everyone who's seen that cover. So it infuriated me as far as mind control, and like putting that into the consciousness of people as though that was legitimate and in process.
Well, and we know that the hand has been a symbol of mind control forever. It's a religious symbol. It's the symbol of, the fist is the symbol of, all of these color revolutions and things like that go on, that George Soros supports and whatnot. But there's that hand that's always, it's like a Indian symbol and a Jewish symbol too. You know what I'm talking about? No, not that. It's just a hand like this, and there's always like
the hamsa.
And the eye in the middle of it sometimes and whatnot.
That's
right?
supposed to be a sign of protection. That's like Middle Eastern.
Right, but it's also, but just like the pyramid is a sign of power, it's been used as a sign of might. They've inversed everything. So all the symbols that like could be freeing have been used as to imprison, right? Yeah. So it's the same thing. So the hand symbology has been used, from the time we're little, we make those little handprints of paint on the construction paper at school and whatnot. These are symbols that have been implanted in the minds of children, since the same time like they were introduced to the globe and the you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. These ideas that cannot be questioned, that like, and so when that symbol is there, even if their conscious mind doesn't remember the words that were on the paper that said, how to stop a civil war, the subconscious picked it up and has internalized that and has eaten it. And yeah.
Exactly. And that was just because I experienced language on such a visceral, transpersonal level. I could feel the effects, and that's where I just freaked out, because I can't stand that they're taking it to this level. So this brings me back to my question to you, which is, what's our move? Like, how does crack?
Right.
Like, it ain't over till it's over. I refuse. There's no way you and I are here and have come this far,
right,
to not stop this, to not offer a different solution, to not lead us elsewhere. So what is the move now?
I mean, I think it's like, it's really just a reiteration of the same move we've been talking about for as long as you and I have been having these conversations. They just keep upping the bait to try and pull us back in to the bickering and to the fighting and to the focusing our energy on fear. What the answer to it is to pull back to the bird's eye view, get a good look at what's going on, right? And to not do those things that are fun, even if they're fun, to provoke and to sort of get involved in the little skirmishes around the edges and whatnot. And instead, we're here. If you're here and you're alive, you have a right to be here and to try and create whatever joy, happiness, success, blah, 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 that you want to do, and to not lose focus on what you're here to do. It's not that we don't pay attention to what's going on, but we don't let ourselves get pulled back into it. It's kind of like when you're trying to get out of a bad relationship and the person keeps doing the ooey gooey thing to bring you back in, right? All of these escalations are bait to try and get feisty people like you and I to re-engage.
Totally. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate the reminder. And it's a constant, and I'm getting so much better of just like, don't feed that construct. Do you think there's any value in trying to wake other people up to the sham show?
This is so basic. Like, everyone who's going to wake up has woken up. There might be a few stragglers that come in later, but they'll be highly motivated and they'll seek you out and find you. So I think what we do is we continue to leave our breadcrumbs of commenting on the situation. Just like when we go back now, we read, someone like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you know, the Gulag Archipelago, talking about what was happening there. It's important for historical context so people understand the world that they're living in, that we leave these time capsules for people to look at, right?
Right.
And we create our community. We create our communities of people that are, you know, I don't always love the word like-minded because I don't like the idea of a hive mind or everyone being the same, but communities that are moving in the same direction, which is
it's sovereign people.
It's sovereign people. It's creative people who are willing to create their way out of this as opposed to wait for somebody to come and save them, right? And the people who are the latecomers to the party, they'll figure it out. You know what I mean? They'll figure it out how to find us. Yeah. Right. But the mass awakening stuff, like I did a show with Masaki, and he was like, in time of like gathering a lot of information and stuff like that and figuring out what's going on, that is over. Now it's just about doing. Right. So, you know, kind of thing. Creating.
Go ahead.
Creating and taking all the things that we've learned from the period of time that we were consuming a lot of information and whatever, and putting it to action, putting foot to action kind of thing, and not you know, we can still take in some new information, but it's limited amount, not enough to pull us back down into that place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd be curious to know from anyone who's watching this, like, as far as their thoughts on solutions. But I do feel like unifying and mobilizing is key, as well localizing.
Well, getting together, yeah.
In terms of resources and allocating our resources and creating our sustainable lifestyles, because my sense is that that's going to be more and more regulated and become more and more difficult. And council clear, like, it's definitely not my intention to see that. But again, you and I have been watching this coming down the pipeline for a long ass time. So
I think one thing that's important is to stop being satisfied with online connection and making it a point of like these people of getting together with the people who are of your community, right? Like, you know, like what's one of the things that people really liked at that conference I just spoke at, like people who've been communicating with each other on people's chat rooms or Facebook pages for years finally got to be together and be with each other. So making more of a point of regular physically actually being in the same space, even if that means that you need to relocate to an area where there are more people who are of like mind or interested in.
Oh my God, are you coming to
Fe?
Santa Fe?
So, I mean, you know, I think that we all have certain levels of attachment to the places that we're from. One of the things that I would suggest to people and that I'm considering is to live part of the year in one place and part in another. And
a lot of people are having that right now.
And maybe how you do that, for some people it might be living in a big city for part of the year and living in a more off the grid kind of place the rest. For others it might be living in a place with different climates or in a different country. For me, what it really is for part of the year maybe living in a place where like I'm digging in and doing a lot of work out there, and the other part of the year I live in a place that is time for restoring and resuscitating myself and taking care of myself, feeding my inner needs so I can go back out into the outer world and, you know, offer to the people, you know, what I think is good and helpful and whatnot, you know.
I feel the same because obviously we're both city girls.
Mm-hmm.
And I did go on a deep Agenda 21 dive this week, and it seems like they're wanting to herd us into the big cities.
Yeah.
Like that is part of, and I will say, just having been in Santa Fe for a few weeks, that it is so palpable how much freer, better, calmer, like saner this environment. It just feels like the eyes and the grip of all those matrix constructs just feel so not relevant here.
Yeah. No, I mean, I make sure that, you know, at least every other month or something like that, I get away for at least a weekend to someplace that isn't Los Angeles, even if it's just a couple of hours away, and I can feel what I understand that, I feel that. So yeah, that's something I'm considering. People might want to consider that. You know, if you have been, you know, I was having a conversation with a producer of another podcast last night. We were talking about like, so for those of us who have developed our own online communities based around the shows we do or whatever, figure out where like there happens to be 10 or 15 people who are part of your following online that live, and maybe that's a good place to spend part of the year instead, you know what I mean, or being around your people. And you know, if you're a person who, does things, offer services to clients and whatever. That might be a more logical community for you to exist in for part of the time, because there's people there that are interested in what you do, and they may have friends that might, or whatever. So I think we have to start not being so identified with what we've done in the past and how we've made our living and the things that we've done in the past. Like, there's a lot of people who are afraid to leave careers they've had for a long time because they have financial security, or they want to stick around for a few more years so they can get the retirement or the whatever. And it's like, maybe not. Like, maybe just there's another way to do this. Like, the money, if the economic system goes kaput, that money that you think you've worked for isn't going to be there anyway. So go for contentment and happiness and health and joy and fulfillment now, instead of I was listening to a good podcast. I like to listen to the Jimmy Dore show a lot. Like, his analysis is spot on. His solution is dead wrong, but I don't care. I liked him anyway. I love listening to his analysis, but he had a great interview with a guy named Christopher Ryan, who wrote a book called Civilized to Death. And he talked about how—
the guy who wrote Sex at Dawn as well? Or is that a different Christopher Ryan?
Maybe he is. I'm not sure. He's but his point was that one of the things that the way we've been enslaved is by being told to look to our future, to keep preparing for our future, to make sure you do well at this and that, everything about your future. And that what he has figured out in studying cultures all around the world, there's people that are the most happy are the ones who only worry about their present needs. And not about, like hunter-gatherers.
Like stockpiling.
Hunter-gatherers just they get the food they need for that day, and they're healthier and they're more content. And if their hut blows over, they build a new one. They don't care, And
according to the Gene Keys, that's the difference between abundance and prosperity. Abundance is like fear, stockpiling, the money doesn't circulate among your community, you're just saving it for that scary emergency, versus prosperity, where money moves and flows and you have what you need when you need it, and you're not really hung up.
Yeah. So that was, and people should go. I'll link that Jimmy Dore thing here in the description as well, so people can listen to that. So I think just really start playing with other ideas. We don't have to live a traditional American life. It's actually boring. And it's actually like civil war is part of the traditional American life, and we don't want that. So maybe part of that is just not living the traditional life. You know what I mean? Not let it, it's also part of the element of surprise. Like, people expect me to be in Los Angeles. Well, if I'm not always in Los Angeles, they might not, there's going to be facial recognition software everywhere and all that kind of stuff, but be less predictable in your moves.
That resonates.
Yeah, and don't spend so much time thinking about what you're going to do in the future that by the time it comes, you've already put out enough of this. You've already let enough stuff out there so that they can guess what you're going to do. I mean, even though I just did that myself here, but be more spontaneous and more. That's one of the things that Brandy always says this. One of the things that the humans have capacity for that AI doesn't is the element of surprise. And ingenuity and all that, right? Like the flash thought, I have an idea. Like, the computer doesn't usually do that.
Well, it's also, Joe Dispenza is so much the zeitgeist right now. I keep hearing him.
It's funny because he was like popular years ago, and then he has been quiet, and now he's the big deal again.
He's everywhere. Like, I have so many synchronicities around that guy. But his whole thing is just like, don't do what you've already done. Like in his meditations, you review the day. Like, where were you asleep? Where were you repeating what you've already done? And his whole thing is just like,
that's cool. Yeah.
Get out of that old vibration.
Yeah.
And mix it up.
Yeah. All right. I think we've hit on a lot of stuff here. This was actually really good. We went all over the place.
Awesome. I love having no real pre-show or any idea what we were going to talk about on any level.
Yeah, it was really good. It was awesome. Do you have anything else you'd like to say before we say goodbye to the audience?
I would like to say that
you have a webinar, or you have a group thingy coming up. Let's hear it.
Yeah. So, my 6-week manifestation salon, 2020 Best Year Ever Yet, starts this Saturday. I did take it off of Eventbrite because I'm vetting people more rigorously to make sure that they're willing to take 100% responsibility for their experience of reality, and that we're really vibrating at similar frequencies. And the gist is to gather high vibe reality creators to vision up 2020 as wonderful and amazing as we want it to be, and to hold each other accountable throughout that process. And then there's group coaching on our weekly calls so that we're getting real-time feedback on our languaging habits and where we would otherwise be sabotaging ourselves with the belief systems that are coming through our words. And I'm still available for one-on-one transformational coaching, quantum languaging consulting, so hit me up.
Awesome. You can find her at Words Are Matter or DaniKatz.com. Okay.
Or quantumlanguaging.com.
Awesome. Excellent. All right, guys, you know where to find me. You can find me here. You can find me at Emily Moyer on Facebook. You can find me at offplanetradio.com. We will see you probably soon. Bye, guys. Have a good one.
Bye.